distinguished panellists, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Louise Brooks-Smith, and I'm absolutely delighted as President of the RICS to welcome you to our HQ here in Parliament Square. Pretty crowded square tonight, I think, and so I know a lot of you have had a bit of trouble getting here because of the tube and the demonstrations outside, but really pleased that you've joined us. I have to say, it does not seem a year since we were here last, but as they say, time certainly flies. And it certainly does once you've taken the mantle as president, as I did last June. My feet simply haven't touched the ground since then, and I've been incredibly proud to have been representing the institution and all it stands for around the world. A large part of my messaging in recent months has reflected our role in endorsing the highest possible professional standards. As you'll be aware, ours is a profession founded on technical and ethical standards. And these standards are the basis for trust. The trust that the public as a whole has in the profession as a whole, and the trust that each client has in each individual professional who advises them. It is trust in the profession's ability to self-regulate that allows the RICS to enjoy the enormous privilege of self-regulation. Indeed, this is something that I know is envied by a number of other professional bodies around the world. So trust is at the core of what we do. It's at the heart of who we are. And without it, the value of being a professional just simply diminishes and is at risk of vanishing altogether. Now, while I'm speaking from an RICS perspective, this applies just as much to our fellow professionals in other fields. Trust is won by doing and being seen to do the right thing. And for us, given the growth of our institution and indeed our marketplace, this very much now has an international dimension. It's why the RICS is a founding member of the International Ethics Standards Coalition. For those that aren't aware of it, it's a group of professional bodies which met for the very first time in New York at the UN only last month to develop a standard for consistently ethical behaviour. And the goal is to present the paper and the work by 2016. Building trust in professions and in professionals is also one reason of why we're working with the United Nations Global Compact to develop a best practice toolkit. This is a toolkit that will help responsible businesses respect human rights, observe labour laws, and prevent corruption. Broad areas, yes, but vitally important in terms of acting effectively and professionally. It should be at the core of what we are all about. So with that brief introduction, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to now introduce our speakers for this evening. Firstly, Lord Michael Bichard. Not yet. I'm going to say a few words about you yet. I'm terribly sorry. Damn. Lord Bichard, for those that I'm sure you've got the leaflets in front of you, but Lord Bichard is chair of the Social Care Institute for Excellence, deputy speaker of the House of Lords, and was the first director of the Institute for Government in 2008, a post he held until 2010. He's previously held posts as chief executive of Brent and Gloucestershire local authorities, chief executive of the Benefits Agency, and permanent secretary at the Department for Education and Employment. And in January next year, I understand, Lord Bichard will assume the role of chair of the National Audit Office. Our second speaker is Michael Hershman. Michael is an internationally recognised expert on matters relating to transparency, accountability, governance, litigation and security. Michael is president and CEO of the Fairfax Group and has been retained by governments, corporations, law firms, international financial institutions and the like to assist on matters relating to the conduct of senior level officials and or the entities with which they do business. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our chair for this evening. And I know he's had a bit of trouble getting here and got caught in traffic, so hence the slight delay, but really pleased that you've made it. Steve Kenzie. Steve is Managing Director at the Sustainability Hub and also manages the Secretariat of the Global Compact Network UK, a group of businesses, NGOs and government representatives committed to the UN's corporate responsibility framework. So, my thanks to everyone here this evening and to our speakers, and also to Jonathan Harris for initiating these debates and for his continuing commitment to CPD and lifelong learning. I look forward to a stimulating and lively discussion and would like to now hand over to Steve Kenzie. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Louise, and thank you all for coming tonight. At the core of the UN Global Compact are 10 universally accepted principles in the areas of human rights, the environment, labor standards, and anti-corruption. And these values are connected directly back to UN conventions that are universally accepted. And as such, it really makes the Global Compact a business integrity initiative. And so I have a keen interest in the subject tonight. I'm not going to say very much, except we're going to hear from our speakers brief presentations, and then we're going to have quite a reasonable time, hopefully, to take your questions. So please be thinking of that as you listen, so that we have a lively, if not debate, at least dialogue for the rest of the evening. And so without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Lord Bichard.
Well, it's great to be here, and particularly since this is the Jonathan Harris lecture. Jonathan wanted me to make clear to you that he is still alive and is not looking forward to this becoming the Jonathan Harris Memorial Lecture, and so are we. It's great to see you here, Jonathan. There are some people who argue that we haven't seen an unprecedented breakdown in trust and integrity in this country during the last couple of decades. They argue that instead what we've seen is our more transparent society uncovering much more of the things that were happening anyway. Well, personally, I don't agree with that. I don't agree because I think we have seen an unprecedented breakdown in trust, but also the relative seriousness of these failures, for me, is irrelevant. The fact is that they have happened, and they've happened, let's remind ourselves, in most of our really important institutions and professions. The church, forever tarnished by its failure to tackle child abuse, and then its determination to cover up the fact that this had happened for decades. The city, a litany of dishonesty and fraud. The police for Hillsborough, and numerous failures to deal with miscarriages of justice. The media for hacking and stealing people's privacy, which for me is one of the most heinous of crimes. The BBC for failing to deal with a culture of bullying, abuse and personal greed. And Parliament, let's not forget Parliament, how could I, for allowing expenses fraud to happen and then failing or being unable to take proportionate action against the offenders. This is a frightening charge sheet of transgressions. But for me, the key questions that we should be asking ourselves now is why? Why has this happened, and what can we do about it? Well, are there any answers? I mean, there's certainly no short-term fixes, because as someone was saying to me over coffee, once you lose trust, it's pretty damn difficult to recover it. So there's no short-term fixes, but are there any answers? I just want to make a few suggestions of areas that we should look at. Firstly, I think we should look at the whole issue of education. In basic education, we may have focused, may we, a little too much on the acquisition of basic skills and employability, and given too little attention to the question of ethics, integrity, and social responsibility. You may have noticed recently the chair of the Independent Schools Association claimed that this had indeed happened in state schools, overlooking the inconvenient fact that many of those responsible for some of the worst misdemeanors had the privilege of being educated in the public school system. But we'll leave that to one side. The fact is that wherever education takes place, maybe we need to give a greater priority to developing young people with standards and a determination to adhere to a clear set of personal values. And it's not just in basic education. In the professions, don't we need to ensure that the CPD that is happening gives real priority to this issue? What we expect of professionals, how we expect professionals to react to different scenarios, both here and abroad. Maybe also how we enable professionals, young professionals in particular, to seek support and counsel when faced with difficult situations. So education seems to me to be a pretty important issue. I think another issue which we need perhaps to revisit is targets. Have we become so preoccupied with targets and short-term success, in business not least, that we have lost sight of the importance of developing sustainable companies and sustainable organizations? Many of the targets, most of the targets, you can argue, have more to do with financial growth than they do with client or community benefit or sustainability. Do we need to revisit that and rethink our approach to targets? Do we need to give a stronger emphasis to ethical behavior and standards of personal behavior? And are our professional organizations taking that sufficiently into account? The need to set responsible targets which support the development of sustainable organizations. And what about values? People tend to glaze over still when you talk about values. I don't. I've always thought values were really important to organizations, whether they're public or private. Do we need to have much clearer, explicit values in the private, public, voluntary and academic sectors so that staff and clients are absolutely clear what the company, what the organization stands for? And you'll often find people claiming they have those, but do they actually inform and dictate and control the way in which people practice their personal behavior, the priorities of the organization? It's more common now to hear about value-driven organizations, but really it's less common, less frequent to encounter places where those values really do have an impact on a day-to-day basis. And what about leadership? Organizations do look to leaders to set the tone and the style of the business or the service. There's no getting away from the fact that their behavior and the things that clearly matter to them have a huge influence on the things that are taken seriously in the organization, that are seen to matter to the organization. So do they set the right example? Do they understand still the responsibility they carry? They need to understand that leadership depends on trust, and their transparent integrity is the foundation on which their credibility as a leader is built. And as I say, once you've lost that as a leader, personally, I think it's almost impossible to recover it. So how strongly does all of that feature in our business schools and in our universities? How do leaders react to the danger of losing trust? Is that what really worries them? It worried me as a leader, when I was a leader, more than anything else. If I lost the trust of my staff or ministers or the public, then I knew that, frankly, I was dead. What about sanctions? Do we actually take firm enough action against those who do transgress, who have behaved dishonestly? I don't think we do. Many of those primarily responsible for the banking crisis continue to act as non-executive directors. Peers who fiddle their expenses continue to sit on the red benches. And let me tell you personally, that's an embarrassment. City bankers have rarely suffered personally, and their companies have been fine, they've suffered pain, but it's not been terminal. And if we don't impose sanctions that really do hurt, are people going to think that this is something they need to take seriously? And finally, this may be slightly off the wall. I was talking with Nick Pearce, the director of the IPPR, the other day, and he was making the point that maybe also we, in this country at least, we should be revisiting some of the firewalls that have existed between our institutions, our major institutions in the past, and which have been breached. the too easy, the too cozy relationship between the city, politics, the media, the police and Parliament, and the failure of regulators to police those boundaries effectively, if at all. So maybe we do need to revisit those firewalls without endangering the collaboration that we need between those institutions. Maybe we need to revisit what effective accountability really means, and also revisit the role and effectiveness of our regulators. We have in the past sought comfort in the fact that ethical indiscretions were few and far between, and the odd rotten egg will always surface. The worry, as Mark Carney pointed out just this week in the context of the city, is that in the banking system, for example, scandals are no longer isolated, they are endemic. And my point is that we should be talking a great deal more about why that is the case and how we tackle it. And I don't think that there is any more important issue for professions to be discussing and debating at the moment, and that's why it's so good to have tonight's debate and to see so many people taking this issue seriously enough to come out. Thank you.
Thanks, Lord Bichard. And now, Michael Hershman, please.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the Royal Institute for inviting me to speak this evening. Lord Bichard has already said everything that I was going to say. So next time, I would like to go first. As a co-founder of Transparency International, I have spoken all over the world on issues related to ethics and transparency and accountability. But this is my first time ever on the same platform with the Lord. I was raised in Brooklyn, New York, and the only lords we had were landlords. But I'd like to put a few propositions on the table to begin. Firstly, corporations are not corrupt. People are corrupt. And people will always be corrupt. We're not going to eliminate corruption in our society. That, by the way, is good news for those who practice in the field of anti-corruption services. In the 18th century, and I wasn't here then, but I understand that your own British Lord Chancellor, Edward Thurlow, said, "Did you ever expect a corporation to have a conscience when it has no soul to be damned and no body to be kicked?" So when you peel back the onion, behind the corporate veil are indeed the leaders, the corporate leaders. And if those corporate leaders only rely on compliance programs to ensure integrity, transparency, and accountability, they will fail. This is because compliance is an outcome and not really an approach. I favor the value-based approach, and one in which you ask yourself, do we have clear and espoused values providing effective guidance to our deciders so that they can make the right decision? This is the more effective approach, the value-based approach. Decision-making must be aligned with core values. And this is what has been basically missing in terms of our modern society and the way corporations conduct themselves. Tone from the top has become a common phrase. It's not tone from the top. Any chief executive can stand in front of a microphone and say, we're going to have high values, we're going to operate with high degrees of integrity. What is he going to say otherwise? We're going to operate this corporation in a dishonest fashion? No, of course not. It's not tone from the top, it's actions from the top. It's how the leadership of a corporation behave on a day-to-day basis, not only in their professional lives, but their personal lives. That's what the people in corporations look at, and that's how trust is indeed built. You know, too often, we have relied on corporations to have values that are really kind of legacies passed on by the founders. I mean, many of the corporations in the Western world were founded by family members. Walmart, for example, so founded by Sam Walton. And they established a set of values that we've heard time and time again. We want to provide the best product and the best service to our customers. But today we really have to talk about different sets of values. Not that providing good service and good value to customers is not important, but today we have to have values which affirm integrity, respect, teamwork, transparency, building employee engagement, things like that. This is what people are expecting of corporations today. Corporations have a role to not only satisfy their stakeholders. Lord Bishop told about short-term financial goals. If a corporation is simply there to take from the community and give nothing back, that corporation at one time or another is going to find itself in a position of having a scandal and losing a reputation. We all know it takes a lifetime to build a good reputation and only seconds to lose it. And indeed, once a corporation has suffered damage to its reputation, the road back is very, very slow and very difficult. For the last 2 years, I'd been working on the Independent Governance Committee for FIFA, an organization I think you all are familiar with and perhaps have been reading about. So over the course of the 2 years, my committee, and frankly, FIFA would have never formed this Independent Governance Committee unless it was backed into the corner that it is in today, rocked by scandal, rocked by mistrust, rocked by damaged reputations. We made a series of recommendations, many of which have been adopted by FIFA, but not all. Let's look for a moment at some of the recommendations we made that they did not adopt. Term limits. As we all know now, Mr. Blatter has served either as Secretary General or President of FIFA for 35 years and just declared that he's going to run again for another 5-year term after having stated at the last election that he would no longer run. We asked that they disclose their compensation. Now, they're not a public company, they're not an international organization, but they are an NGO, and they have certain advantages granted to them by the state being an NGO. They don't have to pay taxes. And so don't you think there should be some transparency, some rule or regulation somewhere that states that they should disclose to the public what they're paid and what their benefits are? We ask that they appoint several independent members to their board of directors. They call their board of directors executive committee members. And some of those executive committee members have been on the executive committee of FIFA since the 18th century, I think. They're dinosaurs. They think in the dark ages. They don't think that FIFA should be accountable to anyone. They don't think that FIFA they think that FIFA should have total autonomy and should be a self-regulating organization. Well, we've seen this week where self-regulation can get you if you don't have some form of community or governmental oversight. Blatter, well, let me take a step back. The point I'm trying to make here is when an organization gets to the point where the reputation is so damaged, the only hope, and it's a small hope, of reputation recovery is in replacing the leadership. There are some corporations that have gone through scandals of a similar weight. I think of Siemens, for example, in Germany, just back in 2007 and 2008, the largest corporate scandal in the history of the world in terms of bribery. I'm not talking about the financial industry scandals, but they replaced their leadership. And in the course of 5 or 6, 7 years now, they have instituted programs that have made them a model for other corporations to follow. And they have been able to recover their reputation to some degree. There are other companies that have not been so successful, in part because they haven't changed their leadership and have not created a core set of values that people can believe in. Siemens took an approach, as have other companies, that not only did they need to reform internally, and I realize I'm running out of time, so give me in just another few seconds if you don't mind. Siemens began to reform from the outside as well. So they built a very strong internal compliance program, but that's just the first step. The second step is they reached out across the world to organizations involved in anti-corruption work, like Transparency International, and let it be known that they wanted to become a player internationally in the anti-corruption movement, that they wanted to give back to society. A fund was created, $100 million fund, to fund NGO activities in the area of anti-corruption services. Corporate social responsibility dictates today that companies look outward as well as inward. And I hope we'll have a chance during this debate tonight, although given the fact that I think we're pretty much on the same side of this issue, I'm not sure how much of a debate it's going to be. But I hope that we'll be able to address some of the issues surrounding corporate social responsibility and giving back to the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. If I'm not mistaken, these are microphones, is that right? You can still hear me? Yes, okay, good. Thank you both very much for getting this. So I was hoping we'd hear about FIFA, expecting we would hear about FIFA, so I'm glad. I think maybe I'll kick off the questions by asking a FIFA-related question, as in what do you anticipate coming next? Do you know Mr. Garcia?
Well, I do know Mr. Garcia. One of the proposals that the Independent Governance Committee made was to create an independent ethics committee with 2 separate divisions, an investigative division, which is headed by Mr. Garcia, and a adjudicatory division, which is headed by Judge Eckert, a sitting judge from Germany. And we helped appoint those 2 to their roles. Mr. Garcia, as a result of allegations, some of which emanated here in the UK, regarding the 2018-2022 World Cup, undertook an investigation to determine whether there had been any undue influence, if you will, in the choices of both Moscow and Qatar in those respective World Cups. He issued a 400-page report with something like 400 or 500 attachments, gave it to the adjudicatory committee, which is the process we created, and the Judge Eckert decided to summarize it and make recommendations on sanctions to the executive committee of FIFA. And that, of course, brings us to today, where unfortunately Michael Garcia was unhappy with the summary and claimed that it misrepresented his findings and conclusions. Michael Garcia and Judge Eckert met today. I am hopeful that tomorrow we will hear that they've reached a resolution where the fuller report will be revealed to the public, with protections for those witnesses who may have been guaranteed confidentiality. But this organization, regardless of what the report says, and regardless of where the World Cup is going to be held in 2018 or 2022 or going forward beyond that, I said this week on CNN, and I'll repeat it here, Mr. Blatter has got to be given credit for a lot of good things he did at FIFA, but he has to take responsibility for all of the scandals that happened under his leadership. He cannot simply say, I didn't know about that, because that's a failure in itself. And so I've asked this week that he resign, I don't expect he'll do that, nor do I expect he'll invite me for a drink anytime soon.
Would you go, though?
Would I go? He's a very, I have to say, he's quite a charming man, and his charm is only exceeded by his sense of politics. He has an amazing feel for the organization and how to keep himself in power.
And with new leadership, do you see a way back? FIFA Phoenix?
Yeah, with new leadership, I see a way back, but it will take a very, very long time. And again, not only new leadership, but to adopt some of the other recommendations that we called for, independent members of the executive committee, term limits. If they fulfill those, they create a new culture in the organization. This is my biggest concern. Now they have a written code of conduct, which we helped write, and which all of them should understand, particularly those on the executive committee. But right after the World Cup in Brazil, only a few months ago, they left that country with $16,000 watches on their wrist that were provided to them by the host committee in Brazil, clearly against the new code of conduct. That tells me that the values of the organization, the culture of the organization has not yet changed, and it will be years before it will.
So,
unless the United Nations steps in.
well, yes, there's a fast-acting, inefficient entity, if ever there was one. Lord Bichard, one of the points, you raised many issues. One that particularly caught my attention. We're living in a time where there's a shifting responsibilities between the public and the private all the time, I think back and forth, depending on how one likes to define those. So in terms of responsibility for imbuing values in our children, is that a public responsibility? Is it, which sounded like you would like to see a role or a greater role for schools in doing so. I could hear someone saying, isn't that what parents are for?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how strong a role do we want the state, the education system to play in ethics and values?
Well, I think it's a shared responsibility, but I mean, kids do spend quite a lot of time in school. The only point I was making is that maybe sometimes we've been more concerned about numeracy and literacy, rather important, I agree, than we have in developing people with character and with a sense of responsibility. The Brits have always taken great pride in the fact that we develop the whole person. I'm not sure that we haven't lost that a bit. And I think sometimes the Brits, we need to be a bit more self-critical. You're okay here. We need to be a bit more self-critical. I don't know whether anyone noticed that last week there was the results of a survey around the world of countries, peoples that were trusted. We didn't come in the top 20. Now, I mean, that has got huge implications for our business, for our economy. It would never have been the case, I don't think, 20, 30, 40 years ago, but it is the case now. So we've lost that as a nation. I think we've lost a lot of the trust that people invested in us. No, on your question, yeah, it's parents and it's schools. But it's also, as I was saying, it's a continuing education process. I mean, when I was Permanent Secretary, what we were trying to do is to get people to understand that education doesn't stop at 16 or 18, and actually it's a lifetime experience. Well, professions have got a real responsibility, I think, to invest in that. And I think what Jonathan has done, without flattering twice in the same evening with the CPD Foundation, is incredibly important. But we ought to revisit that and ask, what are we doing? What is the CPD that we're doing? Is there enough emphasis on these issues?
And I think what children learn in school goes well beyond the curriculum and some of the cultural issues of integrity through the system and through heads and teachers as well. Or the kids are learning from what they see.
They do, yeah.
May I just add something? We have to be very careful about trying to take our values and export them to countries that have far different cultures. When I was a child, and this goes to your point, and sat around the dinner table with my parents, they drilled into me, you don't steal, you don't lie, you don't cheat, you work hard, you take responsibility. If you go to Africa, for example, and sit around that same dinner table, assuming there is a dinner table, assuming they have enough food on the table, the conversation is quite different. It's how to survive on a day-to-day basis. And one of the means of survival in some of these countries in the Southern Hemisphere is to go into government service. And kids are told in many households in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere that if they can get a job in civil service, they can provide for their families and for their villages. Well, unfortunately, they can't because they're not paid enough, whether it's as a policeman, as a minister, or as a customs official. And so they turn to taking bribes. I once spoke to a former minister who had been imprisoned in Africa for taking a bribe, one of the few that have gone to jail. And I went to see him and I said, you know, why do you find yourself in the position you're in today? And he said, well, I had a responsibility to take care of the people from my village who are less fortunate than I am. And I had to generate money to be able to send to them so they had enough food. Now, I did say to him at the time, I said, well, that's fine, but do you allow them to use the condominium that you have in London? And what about the expensive jewelry and cars that you've purchased for your wife? So, you know, it's a question of understanding the culture, trying to help them correct the deficiencies in their society so that we'll not have to rely on bribes just to be able to survive.
I have more questions, but we should share the airtime. Does anyone else have a, yes? In the middle of the room, yes, the young lady there.
We're just testing the microphone, we haven't got it, sorry.
I'll have a go.
Okay, please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
I'm interested in really addressing a question to Michael Hershman about the sanctions, the reaction of other organisations. I'm picking up the FIFA example, but I guess we could think of others. We know when organisations that are direct to the customer, on social media now, when people get wind of something is not right, they can decide to raise petitions or not buy from that company. But I wonder, do you think there is any possibility that the reactions of other organisations, those who sponsor the FIFA matches, the countries who put forward teams to play, or indeed the football clubs who release their players to play for the national team, surely when we don't react and say, well, we don't want to deal with this organisation, we are tacitly saying they're all right really. When they've sorted this little thing out, they will, they'll be all right and we'll carry on as before. So, is there some way, is this a realistic way in which we can, as society around the world, insist on better behaviour?
Thank you. That's a very good. Frankly, I was afraid you were going to ask me who I thought was better, Ronaldo or Messi. That's a very good question. If we're going to see reform in sporting organizations, whether it be FIFA or the National Football Association in our own country or the National Basketball Association, the sponsors have got to come to the table. They've got to put pressure. The lifeblood of these organizations are the sponsors and the media companies that bid on the rights to show the events, the competitions. It's interesting to me that if Tiger Woods makes a mistake, the sponsors immediately withdraw support. Or Lance Armstrong. The first thing that happens is sponsors withdraw the sport. If FIFA or the International Olympic Committee or some other sports organization is subject of a scandal, all they do is the sponsors pay lip service. Well, we expect integrity from our partners. That's not good enough. They have got to come to the table and tell these organizations that they are going to stop bidding on the rights and stop providing money for sponsorships unless they get their act together. It's interesting, Just today, perhaps it was late yesterday, Adidas came out with a very strong statement. Adidas is one of the largest sponsors for FIFA, $900 million a year. And they had a very strong statement that enough is enough. We've got to straighten out this mess at FIFA. So how do we do this? We have to go to the stakeholders in the sponsor organizations, whether it be Adidas or Nike or Mercedes-Benz or Volkswagen, General Motors, whoever they are. The institutional investors, the shareholders have got to go to them and say, look, we don't want you putting your money into partner organizations that are not reputable. And that, if that happens, that will force the FIFAs of the world to change.
But I think there's a wider and more interesting question, really, that you raise, and that is, in a world of social media, forget about the sponsors and the big institutions and the corporates. In a world of social media, could we look forward to action from the public, from citizens, against institutions, corporates, or individuals who behaved unethically? Now, we began to see some of that with Starbucks and tax, and Google, but actually it kind of peaked and then went away again. So, well-known comedians who were, had creative taxation, I must be careful what I say, arrangements are still very popular on the television. But we began to see that happen. Could you, in 5 years' time, begin to see real social action on ethics and trust and integrity? I think you might.
Unfortunately, a counterexample is that Chad Evans, the footballer recently released from prison and seems to have the social media more on his side, but the power is there. Well, it's just a matter of channeling it into more
well, I wouldn't want to get in the Chad Evans. I mean,
no, but
the answer to your
point
question
of the
is
social media, I think, is quite pertinent, though the power is there if it can be channeled.
Yeah, it is, and it will become greater.
We have a microphone. Do we have a question?
Good evening. Adrian Wilson from Knight Frank. We're a large organisation, and it's great to hear about what FIFA's doing for the whole anti-corruption situation. But there's a lot of small practitioners. We have to try and manage money laundering, all those items that are managing in our business from day to day. So it's great to hear about what FIFA's doing. It's great to hear about all those situations. But how do we actually manage that day to day? From our own businesses, it's, FIFA's a massive organisation. And Knight Frank is a massive organisation as well. But actually, in reality, for the day-to-day practitioners, how do we actually manage that? How do we actually manage conflicts of interest, money laundering, all those items, which are very, very important. Very important. So we're sort of almost like trying to blasé the situation about how it works. It's about trying to, maximise the situation about how it works. Well, so for general practitioners, how does that actually work?
The Lord goes first.
Yeah, I was going to say, some of the things that I was talking about, I think, are about getting people to develop a sense of values which enables them to tackle those sorts of situations. Now, those sorts of situations, there's no formula, there's no answer, there's no silver bullet for dealing with those. And sometimes they are really difficult, complex ethical decisions. That's why when they're taken, you need people to be taking them who have a sense of ethics and values and have developed that over time, whether it's in families or in schools. I'll tell you one of the tests that I always applied. I would never take a decision that I would not have been prepared to defend publicly. Not just in front of the Public Accounts Committee, who are always interested in what I did, but publicly, Because if you're not prepared to defend it publicly, it means you don't think it's the right decision. And if you take that decision, then you lose respect. And as we keep saying, once you've lost respect, you've lost it. I only ever asked in organisations that people respected me. I didn't expect everyone was going to like me, because actually if everyone liked me, well, it's impossible, but maybe you're not doing the right things anyway. but I did expect them to respect me, or want them to respect me, to trust me, to think that what I did honestly. If you don't feel that's the case in any single decision, then you're getting it wrong.
Michael.
I know we're living in a difficult time where sometimes the rules, the regulations, and laws seem overwhelming and contradictory. And so it's not easy for a corporation today, particularly a corporation involved in global business, to try to comply with the law. And in fact, if you're working for a large multinational, the fact of the matter is, regardless of how strong your compliance program is, someone is going to make a mistake and violate the law. The hope is that, of course, it won't be a systematic practice within the corporation. And I really, by the way, feel very sympathetic towards small and medium-sized businesses which don't have the resources to be able to hire compliance experts and expensive attorneys to help them develop these programs. But, I think we have to take a step back. What are we really talking about? When was it okay to bribe? When was it okay to launder money? When was it okay to engage in human rights violations and slave labor and trafficking? It never was. And if, all the compliance programs, all the written policies and practices in the world are not going to stop someone who has a criminal intent. What will help is if a company vets the people appropriately that they hire to make sure that they have the same core values that the company has. What will help is if the company, as time goes on, evaluates, rewards, and if necessary, punishes the people whose core values go outside of that of the companies. Yes, over here.
Thank you. Listening with great interest to what you've been saying, there's one fundamental problem I've wrestled with for many years. Most of the business leaders, most of our leaders in politics, have in fact been granted an education from universities. But universities always struck me as being based on the theoretical, what you could do, how you could improve things. How do you get ethics in the theoretical? And this, I think, was exemplified in London in the 16th and 17th centuries. They formed Gray's Inn. They formed the Inns of Court. Now, why they formed it was that in Europe, a lot of the law went into universities. In the UK, or England as it was called in those days, they actually realised that they did not want universities to handle the training of lawyers. And what I've seen is that ideal of what I would describe as practice drivers, not theoretical drivers, has been lost since the advent of the Second World War. Because where are a lot of our lawyers coming out of? Universities. All that background stuff where you worked as a clerk or, a beginner has gone. And I'm just wondering if we've lost what you gents are quite rightly highlighting as what we should be getting back. Thank you.
I'm a university-educated lawyer, so I feel somehow equipped to answer the question. I think I'd probably disagree with you in the sense that I see absolutely no reason why a university education shouldn't incorporate the kind of values that you obviously feel are important, and so do I. And I went to a university which I think did that. I went to Manchester, which is why Ronaldo is the answer to your question. but it's very important that that happens. I went on to be a Vice Chancellor of a university which only provided vocational courses. It was University of the Arts here in London. And again, I hope that we did try and develop a sense of integrity in our students and integrity as they went into business. So I don't think, you know, that they are kind of. I think universities have got to take this seriously. I think some of them do, and some of them perhaps don't.
Thank you for that clarification. I thought Manchester was a football team.
It's actually a religion, but you don't.
But you know, it's look. Universities are now catching up and catching on with their responsibility to help teach values and ethics. There's a lot of new thinking going beyond the theoretical. A lot of them are using case studies, practical examples of value and ethical dilemmas to students, not only in law school, but in business schools. And I've noticed it's kind of interesting. I love speaking with university students. It really is uplifting for me. And 15 years ago, when I went to universities, whether they be Manchester or Warwick or whatever they might be, or Harvard or Columbia, the students, when they were asking me questions, really were more focused on, we want to get a job that creates wealth. You know, we want to go to, how do we get a good job on Wall Street so that we can make a lot of money, live well, have fancy cars, big homes. Now, and this just happened recently when I was speaking at Columbia Business School, the graduate program, the questions are, how do we find an ethical company to work for, a reputable company? And the questions are also, how do we balance life and work? You know, we want to find a balance for ourselves. We want to build a happy life, not entirely stress-free life, but a happy life. And so it's, you know, it's important to teach values and ethics in school, but it's far more important to have the kids coming into school with a strong set of values and ethics.
Just an announcement to our friends out in the ether on the internet. We can accept questions if you type them through the chat function, so please feel free. Go ahead, sir.
Just sticking on the football scene, how do you see the social media reaction to Jennifer Ennis saying that she's going to withdraw her support from her football team, and the grief that she's getting from the outside world in terms of standing up for what you think is right?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get that question. Could you help me out here? What was that?
Well, I think it's the attacks that one of our great athletes is suffering as a result of having made statements about the football player who Sheffield are thinking of re-employing, despite the fact he's got a conviction for rape. I spoke earlier, I don't know whether it's going to deal with your question, but I spoke earlier about social media perhaps being a positive force in the future. I think it can also be a very damaging negative force. And any of us who've been in the eye of a storm around social media can tell you just how distressing and difficult that is. I mean, 2 years ago, I was misquoted as suggesting, sorry about this for some of the audience, that pensioners should have to work for their pension. I didn't say that, but it got on the ether, it got into the blogosphere, and I was getting 350 obscene emails every morning when I woke up. Now that is not nice. No, I mean, I know you're smiling, but I tell you, if you're in the eye of that sort of storm, it can destroy you. Particularly if you're being accused of having said something or done something which runs against all of your basic principles. So social media is a really interesting discussion point, but it can be a force for good, it can be a force for damage and evil in our society, and I think we're still working out. I mean, you doubtless are more of an expert on this than I am. I think we're still working all of that out.
This is an important issue because star athletes serve as mentors to our youth. And I have very little sympathy for star athletes who make a lot of money who go across the line. We had a recent incident in the United States, you perhaps have read about it, in our National Football League. That's our football, the guys that wear the helmets. Ray Rice, a star running back, knocked his wife unconscious in an elevator in a casino in Atlantic City. This is all filmed. They filmed him hitting his wife, one punch, and she was out, and he dragged her out of the elevator by her feet. The commissioner of the National Football League suspended him for 2 games. What kind of message are we sending to our youth? Yeah. You know, the kids who model themselves after people like this guy Rice, after others who violate the laws, be they the drug laws or sexual abuse or discrimination or whatever it may be. I have, in my judgment, we should have 0 tolerance for athletes that go beyond the law.
Yeah, but it's not just athletes. It's the point I was making earlier about sanctions. I mean, if you send out messages by the way you react, we react to situations. The message that's sent out from that was that this didn't really matter very much. And I think that's why I'm concerned about the lack of sanctions being applied to some of the breakdowns that we've seen. But I think also, let's bring it closer to home. I don't mean nationally, but closer to home. The people in this audience, and I'm acutely aware of it myself, you are role models, you are leaders. People are looking, your staff, your junior staff are looking to you for an example, but also for counselling and support. And I think sometimes we get too modest and we think, oh, well, they wouldn't, no one would listen to what I have to say. But actually, people do. So I think it's important to get personal integrity right for that reason, but it's also important to make ourselves available to help people through really difficult ethical questions that they're having to face. Because some of us have been through it. I mean, when you get to our age, joking aside, you've been through most of the kind of situations that are going to be encountered by young professionals. So it's not just the professional organisations, it's each of us individually being prepared to sit alongside someone who's experiencing a really difficult decision and helping them through it.
You're not a rapist at Sheffield United, though, are you?
Well, I hope not, no.
No, exactly.
No, but this is
a very special situation that someone needs to work out, right?
This is an important point. Again, it goes to the issue of not only tone from the top, but actions from the top. A couple of years ago, I was called in by a CEO of a fairly large company in the Midwest in the United States. And he said to me, look, we're facing a financial problem in the company, and we're going to have to terminate thousands of employees. And this company really was the main employer of this city in the Midwest. And he felt terrible about it. He said, these people are my family, you know, and it's not only going to affect them, it's going to affect their wives, their children, vendors in the community. And he said to me, I'd like your advice on how I help their transition, how I communicate to them. And of course, I began talking to him about what you traditionally would think would be helpful, outplacement services and such. The phone rang on his desk, and I stood up to walk out while he reached for the phone. He motioned me to sit down, and I listened to him negotiating a lease on a new Rolls Royce. And I thought to myself, no, wait a second. This is a guy who's about to lay off over 2,000 employees, and he's going to be driving around this town in a new Rolls Royce. You see the contradiction here. You know, people in leadership roles, us, people that others look up to, have got to behave ourselves in a fashion where we appeal to the trust in those that do look up to us.
And it's challenging when there are multiple constituencies that one needs to address, such as a football team that has a fan constituency and a broader public, and that's it. Finding that balance is going to require a great deal of worldly experience and hopefully some core values. Yeah. Who's next? Yeah.
Suzanne Jackson, London Road, Bexley. I actually know nothing about football, but one of the things I do think causes some of the problems is money. Why do people do these things? Generally it's money, power, to undermine somebody else. I've never had any ethics training in my life, but I know what's wrong.
Yeah.
And people do these things even though they know it's wrong. So I think all the training in all the world is not necessarily going to help. But what will help is, as you have said, that we, as mentors, etc., make sure that when we're dealing with our colleagues, etc., we set the proper examples. People at the top need to set examples, and then people will follow. You need to have checks. Working for a local authority, we have to have loads, and whilst sometimes they're bureaucratic, they do stop a lot of those issues. But I think it's money.
Well, I mean, I'm with you on that. Just developing it a bit, one of the things that strikes me as I get older is that the most important thing you have as a person is your brand. I know that sounds an odd thing to say, but your personal brand is the one thing, it's the one thing I wouldn't want kind of destroyed, really. And to do, it's somehow trying to get across to people that it's just not worth it. You know, making the money is not worth it if you end up losing people's respect and you lose your personal brand. I think the other thing we haven't perhaps picked up, which someone else reminded me of, do you know one of the things about leadership that worries me sometimes when I see it happening is when leaders of organisations, their first reaction to criticism or to a potential scandal is not to go to find the facts, but to defend the institution. And we've seen it with the church, we've seen it with the police, and we've seen it with the BBC, which is why I mentioned them earlier. And I think you leaders have got a responsibility to a wider community, and if accusations are made about their organisation or their staff, then they have a responsibility to that wider community to get the facts, to find out what's happened, not to immediately defend the institution.
Lest they find themselves defending the indefensible.
The indefensible, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to bring the conversation back into the room for probably what most of us sitting around here do. The wide-ranging topics you discuss here. Well, we're professional people in this room. What's the definition of a profession? I struggle with the subject of integrity. Not because I don't have personal integrity, not because I don't work with people with integrity. But I find one of the biggest consequences of a lack of integrity is this concept of sanctions. And you say, well, at the point in time you arrive at the subject of sanctions, you've already lost the debate. You know, you've missed the point. There's lots of parallels in the construction and the built environment industry, as there are in public service, politicians in particular, and the bankers. And a lot of it is derived from a lack of timely education. And what I mean by that is that we are all in a rush to over-promote and accelerate careers, and we don't give enough emphasis to learning your trade, learning your profession, not putting yourself into a position where you're put on a spot and you could, through a lack of experience, suffer from a lack of integrity and make a mistake. What's your thoughts on that?
I've always been an advocate of ambition, but ambition without borders is a very dangerous thing. And we spoke earlier of companies with short-term goals, particularly public companies that have to report on a quarterly basis. The same applies to what you're referencing, and that is people within organizations that have unbridled ambition and would do anything to get ahead. That goes back to the issue of core values. If you have ambition and apply it while at the same time using those core values, in my judgment, you'll get ahead a lot quicker. You know, we look at the surveys today. Only 21% of the people believe that leaders are ethical today. Business leaders are ethical today. And I think in part it is due to social media and the fact that time is dead and distance is moot, and any blemish that occurs, whether it be to a politician or whether it be to a corporation, is immediately seized upon by the public through the media and social media. And so the responsibility is both internal to oneself and external to those that are posting to ensure that the information they're circulating is accurate. But I'm an optimist. I mean, I said earlier that in my remarks that we're never going to get rid of corruption. I fully believe that. I mean, in the United States, we have corruption, even though we have the strongest laws and the most aggressive regulators and prosecutors perhaps in the world. We'll never get rid of corruption. Yet I see a light at the end of the tunnel. I would have never, there's no way that I would have ever expected China, for example, to be aggressively pursuing corrupt businessmen and officials like they're doing today. If someone had said to me 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, that China was going to head down this road, I would not have believed it. So the world is getting a smaller, it's becoming smaller, and morality and ethics and values are becoming more common around the world. And while I think your concern is genuine, because you see it on a day-to-day basis, obviously, of those that are willing to put aside good behavior and good values for self-promotion, I hope we're on the precipice. I hope we're turning a corner here that will lead to greater moderation in the future when it comes to ambition.
I'm quite glad you brought us back in the room. It's a really good question. My answer is that unrealistic ambition is dangerous. That individuals have got a responsibility for their own development, and they ought to be looking to ensure that they are getting a wide range of experience as early as they can. And that sounds simple, but I've seen, particularly in the civil service, where that doesn't operate, that actually people shy away from the difficult jobs sometimes because they will end up getting a lower box marking and that'll affect their career. So I think we need as individuals always to be looking to develop ourselves, but as leaders in organisations we need to be making sure that we're helping people to develop themselves, that we're giving them that opportunity, that we're exposing them to those experiences. And certainly in my early career I was incredibly lucky to work for someone who was absolutely determined, that I was going to get experience in all the areas that I needed to, and some of it was pretty tough. But I think you need to do that. I'm an optimist too. One of the reasons it's very difficult to generalise about generations, but you said earlier, I think the younger generation, I am very optimistic about our younger generation. I'm a non-exec of a company. We employ 100 people or so. They're all very young. It's why I love working there. I tell you, I have never worked in a company, in an organisation that is more values driven than that place, and it's an absolute joy to be there. So I'm optimistic. The thing that distresses me is I'm not sure the generation that I'm a part of actually has acquitted itself terribly well.
Lots of questions. Okay, while we're back in the room, we should stay. I have a few questions that have come over the internet, but let's take this one.
Adrian Davey, Cambridge County Developments. Also on Governing Council, and we're currently talking about how we move forward in the world, not just the UK. Michael Hershman, you mentioned earlier experience in Africa. I'm wondering how, as a professional body, we develop our ethics and values across all those different cultures where we have, for example, we had a Governing Council meeting in India a little while ago where it's quite common for bags of cement to go missing, for example, because a bag of cement is probably worth more than the employees earn in the entire week. So if one doesn't go in the mixer every now and again, that's fed another family. But of course their roads and their bridges and their buildings also fall down. How do we deal with those emerging nations, those emerging economies, trying to apply standards that may seem odd to them but would be perfectly natural for us?
Well, you've started already to develop codes of conduct and good practices. That's, however, just the first step. The next step, again, is to reach out beyond your borders and to promote collective action amongst your partners, whether they be vendors or some form of consultants, but also amongst your competitors. The construction industry has always been found, at least in the surveys that TI has done, to be one of the ones that is most impacted by corruption, particularly in large infrastructure bids. I see a development inside what we're calling this collective action, where companies are coming together and agreeing, and this is not so different from what the UN Global Compact stands for. You've developed 10 principles. It's still 10, isn't it? You haven't gone beyond that. Okay, well, they've developed 10 principles that companies, many of whom are competitors against one another, sign on to. It's sort of like an integrity pledge to behave in a certain way. And this is becoming the trend of the future. We have the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative that brings together the mining companies, the oil companies. We have the Global Compact. We have the Partnership Against Corruption Initiative, which is part of the World Economic Forum. This is the way that organizations like yours are best able to attack issues related to corruption and unethical behavior by being inclusive and going beyond the boundaries of the written practices to talk about practical experiences and how to avoid getting involved in corrupt and unethical situations.
Perhaps we should employ some criminal masterminds so they can give us examples of things that we shouldn't do. You can teach people not to do. Is that a good idea?
Give you examples of things you shouldn't do. I used to
employ people in the benefits agency to tell me how the system could be defrauded. It's quite easy, actually. Distressingly so. It was then, it's all changed now.
Well, the project that RICS and the UN Global Compact are working on that Louise referred to in her opening remarks is intended to provide guidelines that will be truly international. It's coming out of a consultative process that will be engaging around the world, so it will have some rigor and credibility in challenging markets. Gentlemen, we're running out of time, so apologies to those of you that still have questions. You'll have to save them for during drinks. Gentlemen, perhaps Michael, you can start with any final remarks you'd like to share, and then the last word to Lord Bichard.
The world, as I said, is changing for a better place, and evidence of that is the way this room is filled today. You all came here not to simply fill space, but to learn how to be a better individual, how to be a better corporate citizen. This is a trend that's happening all over the world. There's many of these conferences, workshops going on right now in the United States. The only difference is 5 hours. In Latin America, in Asia, and Africa, people want to know how to lead a more ethical, value-driven life and existence. And it's with your interest and with the help of your Royal Institute that we'll be able to continue the momentum. We have to keep the momentum up. And I say this because there's so many difficult issues facing us in life today. You know, we've got the environmental crisis, the global warming crisis. We've got the Middle East and the ISIS crisis. There's so many things, but frankly, every problem that exists in the world today, there's an element of honesty and integrity that is missing that would help improve the situation. I mean, the Arab Spring, in large part, was motivated by lack of confidence in government because of corruption and human rights abuses and the failure having a failure to have adequate rule of law. So when we think of these international problems today, the crises we face, we have to look beneath them to see what the real foundation of the problems are. And I suspect you'll find that lack of integrity, lack of honesty, lack of transparency and accountability is at the root of many of these problems.
Thanks, Michael.
I think I'm sensitive to your challenge. Bring it back in the room. I want to end by bringing it back in the room. What can we actually do? And I mean, two things occur to me. One, there is a lot of experience in this room, and I think we should use our experience to help younger colleagues in particular to cope with some of these dilemmas. I mean, that's what professions are about. That's what professions have always been about. And I don't think we should be shy in mentoring and coaching and helping people to cope with, difficult decisions, whether they're national or whether international. The second thing, it's only this discussion that's reminded me, but I keep coming back when I'm faced with a really difficult decision, ethical decision, is asking myself, which is the right decision to take, and would I be prepared to defend this publicly? Because actually, if you take a decision you're not prepared to defend publicly, you'll make a complete hash of it anyway. In my world, as a public servant, by the way, I'm a crossbench peer, I'm not a politician, but as a public servant, I was always aware that you could end up on the front page of The Guardian or The Times for something you've done, that some people will agree with you, some people will disagree with you. You just got to do what you think is right and draw on the experience that you've had. And that's at the core of all of this. We can have theories and compliance codes and all the rest of it, but it does come down, as I think you said at the beginning, it's people that can be corrupt, not institutions. We all make mistakes, but that's not the same as a breakdown of trust. So ask ourselves that question all the time and be prepared to help colleagues.
Thank you all for your great questions. Please join me in thanking these gentlemen for sharing their insights with us tonight.